the karma of the Heartless, haunted by a broken promise. In the 18th century, amidst the religious crackdown in Vietnam, two devout families, the Dooms and the Tams, sought refuge on a remote island. The families, bound by close ties, hoped for the union of their children, Huynh and Tam. Yet life takes a tragic turn when death and betrayal rip them apart. After Huynh's parents die, she is taken in by the Tam family, who care for her like their own daughter. Her life seems destined for happiness when a marriage with Tam is arranged. But fate intervenes when Tam leaves the island in search of fortune. A year passes without word, and rumors swirl about his betrayal. In a heart-wrenching twist, Huynh discovers Tam's new life in the city, married to another woman. Her world crumbles as she confronts the depth of his treachery. A sinister and eerie presence begins to haunt their lives, culminating in a tragic and terrifying end. The story weaves themes of love, betrayal, and supernatural vengeance in a chilling, dramatic narrative that leaves no soul untouched. Part 1. The bond between two families. It was the dawn of the 18th century, a time of turmoil and fear in the land of Vietnam. The Nguyen dynasty, in its desperate attempt to control the spread of foreign religions, had launched a merciless crackdown on those who followed the Catholic faith. People fled, desperate to preserve their beliefs and lives, hiding in remote regions to escape persecution. Among these refugees were two devout families, the Dooms and the Tams, who shared more than just their faith. They shared a deep bond that had been forged through years of trust and friendship. The Dooms, led by the stern but kind-hearted patriarch Mr. Doom, were a family of modest means but strong morals. They were respected in their community for their integrity and devotion to their faith, even as it brought them under the watchful eye of the authorities. Mr. Doom's wife, a gentle woman with a nurturing spirit, had passed away years before, leaving him to raise their only daughter, Huynh. Huynh was a girl of uncommon beauty, her almond-shaped eyes glowing with a quiet intelligence, her demeanor graceful beyond her years. Though young, she carried herself with a calm dignity that reflected her upbringing in a house of strict values and piety. The Tams, on the other hand, were a bit more boisterous. Mr. Tam, a robust man with a booming laugh and a quick temper, had been friends with Mr. Doom since childhood. Together they had weathered many storms of life, standing shoulder to shoulder against the trials that came their way. Mr. Tam's wife was a nurturing and practical woman whose warmth filled their home. The Tams had a son, Tam, a boy known for his boundless energy and determination. Unlike Huynh, who was composed and quiet, Tam was full of life, always running, climbing, and exploring every corner of their little world. The two families had always been close, but as the persecution of Catholics grew more intense, they made a bold decision together to leave their homeland behind and seek refuge in the remote, isolated island of Cù Lao. The island was surrounded by dense fog, eerie and mysterious, but it offered the perfect sanctuary, hidden from the eyes of those who hunted them. As the Dooms and Tam sailed across the murky waters toward Cù Lao, their hearts were heavy with fear and uncertainty. The sky overhead was dark and brooding, and the sound of the waves crashing against their small boat felt like a warning. There was an unspoken dread that lingered in the air as they approached the island's jagged shoreline. The island itself was shrouded in mist, its towering cliffs looming over them like silent sentinels. The families couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that something ancient and unseen was watching them from the shadows. Despite this, they knew they had no choice. The island, with all its wild and untamed beauty, would be their new home. As they disembarked, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and sea salt. The wind howled through the trees, whispering secrets that only the island could know. Cù Lao felt alive in a way that was unsettling, as if the land itself was aware of their presence, silently judging their intrusion. But there was no turning back now. Together, the two families settled into their new lives, carving out a small village in the heart of the island. They built modest homes with their bare hands, planting crops and fishing the treacherous waters to sustain themselves. The days were long, filled with hard labor, but there was a sense of relief in the isolation. Here, far from the prying eyes of the Enghian dynasty, they could practice their faith in peace, or so they hoped. As the months passed, the bond between the Dungs and the Tams grew even stronger. They were more than neighbors, they were family, bound by their shared struggles and the isolation of their new lives. It wasn't long before Mr. Dung and Mr. Tam began to discuss the future of their children, Huynh and Tam. The two had grown up side by side, their friendship deepening with each passing day. Huynh, with her quiet wisdom and calm demeanor, had become the steadying force in Tam's often reckless life. Tam, full of energy and ambition, was the spark that brought joy and laughter to Huyhn's world. The families, seeing how close their children had become, began to speak openly of marriage. It seemed only natural that Huynh and Tam should one day wed, sealing the bond between their families and ensuring that their legacy on the island would continue for generations to come. The idea of the marriage filled both families with hope, a symbol of a new beginning in a place far removed from the horrors they had fled. The island, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now seemed like a sanctuary where life could flourish. But beneath the surface of this peaceful existence, something dark was stirring. The island, though beautiful, had a history, one that the Dungs and Tams knew little about. The locals whispered of ancient curses and vengeful spirits that roamed the misty forests and haunted the shores. At night the wind would howl through the trees, carrying with it the faint sounds of distant voices, cries that seemed to rise from the earth itself. There were moments when Huynh would wake in the middle of the night, her heart racing, as if she had heard someone calling her name. She would lie still, listening to the eerie silence of the house, convinced that something or someone was watching her from the darkness. Tam, too, began to feel a growing unease, though he tried to brush it off as nothing more than his imagination. But the island had a way of seeping into their thoughts, twisting their dreams into nightmares. Despite these unsettling feelings, the families pressed on with their plans for Huynh and Tam's future. The two young people, though not yet betrothed, were seen by the community as a perfect match. Huynh, the serene and wise beauty, and Tam, the hard-working and kind-hearted young man. There was no doubt that their union would bring joy and prosperity to both families, but as their bond deepened, so too did the strange happenings on the island. Animals would go missing, only to be found days later, their bodies mutilated and drained of blood. Shadows seemed to move on their own, slithering across the ground like serpents. The once peaceful island began to feel like a trap, its beauty masking a dark and malevolent force that was slowly closing in on them. One evening, as the families gathered for dinner, a cold wind blew through the open windows, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the island itself was trying to smother them. For a moment no one spoke, each person feeling the weight of an unseen presence pressing down on them. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the wind stopped, and the room returned to normal. But the fear lingered in the silence, unspoken but palpable. Mr. Dung, ever the pragmatic man, dismissed the incident as nothing more than a passing storm. But deep down he knew better. He had felt it too, the cold touch of something otherworldly, something that did not belong in their world. As the months passed, the family's plans for Huynh and Tam's future grew more urgent. They spoke of setting a date for the wedding, of building a home for the young couple, of the children they would one day have. But the island had other plans. The once clear path to their future was becoming muddied, obscured by the growing darkness that seemed to creep closer with each passing day. Huynh, though excited for her future with Tam, couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was waiting for them. The dreams had returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. In them she saw herself standing at the edge of the island's cliffs, looking out over the black water. A figure stood beside her, tall, shadowed and faceless. It whispered her name, its voice soft and menacing, like the wind through the trees. She would wake in a cold sweat, the image of the figure burned into her mind. Tam, too, had grown more distant, his once cheerful demeanor replaced by a quiet unease. He would often sit by the water, staring out at the horizon, as if searching for something, though he couldn't say what. The bond between Huynh and Tam, once so strong, began to fray under the weight of the island's malevolent presence. It was as if the land itself was conspiring to tear them apart, to prevent the union that was meant to bring peace and prosperity to their families. And so, the island watched and waited, its dark heart beating in time with the growing fear that gripped the two families. The Duongs and the Tams, once hopeful and united, now found themselves at the mercy of something far older and more powerful than they could have ever imagined. Little did know, the island had already claimed them as its own. Part 2. Tragedy Strikes. The days on Kewlau Island were quiet, almost too quiet, as if the island itself had fallen into a deep, eerie slumber. For Huynh, life had settled into a rhythm of calmness amidst the wild beauty of her surroundings. The island's isolation was a welcome refuge for her family and the Tams, far from the persecution they had fled. Yet, beneath the surface of this serene existence, a shadow was gathering, one that would soon darken their lives in ways they could never have imagined. It started with a whisper, a faint cough from her father, Mr. Duong, that soon deepened into something far more sinister. At first, Huynh thought it was just a cold. Her father had always been a strong, steady presence in her life, a man whose resolve was as unshakable as the towering cliffs of Kewlau itself. But day by day his face grew paler, his breath more labored, and his once powerful voice became a strained rasp. The air in their home grew thick with worry. Huynh's heart ached as she watched her father's body betray him, a cruel twist of fate for a man who had fought so hard to protect her from the dangers of the outside world. He had been her rock, her guardian, but now that rock was crumbling, slipping through her fingers like the sand that lined the island's shores. The nights became long and restless. Huynh would sit by her father's bedside, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, praying silently that each breath would not be his last. But there was an unspoken dread that filled the house. Even the walls seemed to close in, suffocating them with the weight of inevitable loss. The candles flickered weakly in the darkness, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls, as if the very air was alive with a malevolent presence, waiting to claim its next victim. It wasn't long before Mr. Duong succumbed to his illness. His death was sudden, though not entirely unexpected. Yet even in knowing it was coming, nothing could have prepared Huynh for the hollow emptiness that followed. The grief was like a tidal wave, crashing over her, pulling her under into a sea of sorrow where there was no air, no escape. The funeral was a somber affair, attended only by the Tams and a few other families on the island. As Huynh stood beside her father's grave, her heart ached with a pain so deep it felt as though the earth itself had swallowed her whole. The wind howled through the trees, and the sea roared in the distance, as if mourning with her. But even as the earth mourned, there was a coldness that seeped into her bones, a strange feeling that she was being watched, that something unseen lingered just beyond the veil of her grief. If the loss of her father had been a cruel twist of fate, what followed was nothing short of merciless. Only 3 months after Mr. Duong's death, Huyhn's mother fell ill. Unlike her father's slow decline, her mother's health seemed to deteriorate overnight. She went to bed one evening weak but still managing a smile for her daughter, and by the next morning she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Huynh was frantic, torn between disbelief and panic as her mother's condition worsened with each passing hour. It felt like a curse had descended upon her family, like the island itself had turned against them. Every breath her mother took was labored, her body convulsing as though something dark and unseen had wrapped its icy hands around her lungs, squeezing the life out of her. The Tams rushed to their side, offering help where they could, but nothing seemed to make a difference. Huyhn's mother passed within days, leaving Huynh utterly alone in a world that now felt as cold and unforgiving as the island's jagged cliffs. Her heart was shattered, broken into pieces too small to ever be mended. The funeral was a blur of sorrow. The same people gathered again, their faces etched with pity as they watched Huynh, now an orphan, stand before yet another grave. She felt hollow, like her soul had been ripped from her body, leaving behind only an empty shell. The world around her had lost all meaning, and the island that had once been her refuge now seemed like a prison, holding her captive in her grief. It was during these dark days that the Tam stepped in. They couldn't bear to see Huynh left alone, and with no other family to turn to, they welcomed her into their home. Mr. Tam, with his booming voice and warm heart, tried to offer comfort in his own clumsy way, while Mrs. Tam took Huynh in as if she were her own daughter. But even in the safety of the Tam household, Huynh couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows, waiting for her. The island felt different now, colder, more alive in ways that chilled her to the core. Despite their efforts to care for her, Huynh couldn't escape the nightmares. They began shortly after her mother's death, dark dreams filled with whispers she couldn't understand and images of shadowy figures standing at the edge of her vision. Every time she tried to focus on them, they would vanish, leaving her with a sense of dread that clung to her like a second skin. There were nights when she would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the dreams pressing down on her like a leaden blanket. But life, as cruel as it can be, doesn't stop for grief. Time marched on, and the Tams did their best to help Huynh move forward. In the midst of her sorrow, one thing remained constant: Tam. He had always been her closest friend, her confidant, and now with her parents gone, he became her anchor. His presence brought her a small measure of comfort, though even he couldn't erase the haunting sadness that seemed to follow her everywhere. As the months passed, talk of Huynh and Tam's engagement began to surface once more. It had been a plan long in the making, even before the tragedies that had befallen their families. The Dooms and the Tams had always hoped that Huynh and Tam would one day marry, sealing the bond between their families. And now, with Huynh living under the Tam's roof, it seemed like the natural next step. But something about it felt different now. What had once been a joyful prospect, filled with hope for the future, now seemed like a faint shadow of what could have been. Huynh was no longer the bright, carefree girl she had once been. The weight of her loss had changed her, and though she cared deeply for Tam, there was a darkness in her heart that she couldn't shake. Still, the engagement was set in motion. The Tam spoke openly of the union, eager to bring some semblance of happiness back into their lives. Mrs. Tam began to make plans for the wedding, fussing over details in an attempt to distract herself from the sorrow that had settled over their home like a dark cloud. But Huyng's heart was heavy. She wanted to be happy, to move on from the pain that had consumed her, but the island wouldn't let her. It whispered to her in the dead of night, in the rustling of the trees and the howling of the wind. It spoke of things long buried, of secrets hidden beneath the earth, and of shadows that were waiting always waiting. Tam, for his part, was determined to bring light back into Huyng's life. He took her on walks through the island's forests, showing her the beauty of the world around them, trying to remind her of the life they still had ahead of them. But even in those moments of peace, Huynh couldn't escape the feeling that they were not alone. The trees seemed to watch them with dark, hollow eyes, and the wind carried with it a strange, low hum, as though the island itself was whispering warnings they couldn't quite hear. The bond between Huynh and Tam, once strong and unwavering, now felt fragile, as though it could shatter at any moment. They had been bound together by their families, by shared memories and hopes for the future, but now those ties were strained by the weight of loss and the unsettling presence that lingered in the background of their lives. The engagement was announced to the community, and there was a quiet celebration. But even in the midst of the smiles and congratulations, There was a tension in the air, a sense that something was not right. The island, once a place of refuge, now felt like a trap, and as Huynh stood beside Tam, listening to the well wishes of their neighbors, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. She looked at Tam, her heart aching with a mixture of love and fear. She wanted to believe in their future, to hold on to the hope that their union would bring happiness to their lives. But deep down she knew that the island had other plans. The shadows that crept at the edges of her dreams were closing in, and she could feel the weight of something dark and terrible pressing down on her soul. The engagement was supposed to be a new beginning, a way to heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon their families. But as Huynh stood in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by friends and loved ones, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was also the beginning of something far more sinister. The island, with its ancient secrets and haunting whispers, was not finished with them yet. And as Huynh looked out into the darkness beyond the Tam's home, she felt a chill run down her spine, as though something unseen was watching her, waiting for the moment to strike. The bond between the dunes and the Tams had been strengthened by tragedy, but that bond was now intertwined with something darker, something that lurked in the shadows of Chu Lao. And as Huynh and Tam's engagement moved forward, the island watched and waited, its dark heart beating in time with the growing fear that gripped them both. Part 3. Tam's departure. The air on the island was thick with an ominous weight, as if the very essence of Chu Lao had turned against those who dared to live upon it. The days had grown shorter. The once warm and welcoming light now seemed to retreat faster behind the distant horizon, leaving the island blanketed in unsettling twilight. It was during these eerie times, when the wind howled through the narrow pathways like a restless spirit, that Tam made his decision one that would change everything. He couldn't stay here anymore. Not on this forsaken island where the shadows seemed to breathe, where every corner of the dense forest whispered secrets too ancient to comprehend. The island had been their refuge once, a place where they thought they could build new lives, but now it felt more like a cage tightening with each passing day. Tam had dreamed dreams of more than just survival. He wanted wealth, success, a life for him and Huynh that wasn't filled with hard labor and endless toil. He wanted to provide for her, to give her everything she deserved, but those dreams couldn't be realized on Chu Lao. The island had nothing more to offer him. He had heard stories of the mainland of bustling markets, opportunities aplenty, and riches waiting for anyone bold enough to take them, and so Tam, with his heart full of ambition and eyes set on a future far brighter than the one the island could provide, made the decision to leave. When he told Huynh, she was silent for a long time. Her delicate fingers rested in her lap, trembling slightly, and her eyes, usually so soft and filled with warmth, now brimmed with unshed tears. "You're leaving," she whispered, the words barely audible over the wind that rattled the shutters of the small house they shared. Her voice trembled with a fear she couldn't quite name, a fear that had been growing in her heart ever since her parents had passed. Tam reached out, his calloused hand covering hers. "Only for a short time, Huynh," he promised. "Just long enough to find work, make enough money to give us a better life. I'll come back for you. We'll be married, just as we planned." "But what if something happens?" she asked, her voice betraying the anxiety that gnawed at her insides. There was something about the way the wind howled that night, something that sent a chill down her spine. It was as if the island itself was trying to warn them, trying to keep them together. Tam smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing will happen," he assured her, though even as he said the words, he felt a strange unease settle deep in his bones. The island was silent for a moment, as if it too was listening. "I'll be back before you know it," Huynh nodded, though her heart was heavy with a dread she couldn't explain. Something felt off, wrong, like the world was subtly shifting beneath her feet, threatening to pull her into an abyss she wasn't ready to face. She couldn't shake the feeling that once Tam left, everything would change, and not for the better. The next morning, Tam set off for the mainland, his belongings tied up in a small bundle slung over his shoulder. Huynh stood at the edge of the island's dock, watching as the small boat that would take him away cut through the misty waters, leaving a trail of ripples in its wake. She waved, though her heart felt as if it were breaking into 1,000 pieces, and as the boat drifted farther and farther into the fog, Tam's figure growing smaller with each passing second, Huynh felt the first tendrils of fear wrap around her heart. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. At first, Huynh held on to hope, clinging to Tam's promise that he would return soon. She busied herself with preparations for their wedding, though the tasks felt hollow without him there. She imagined what life would be like once he came back, once they were finally married and could begin their new life together. But as the months dragged on, hope began to fade, replaced by an unsettling sense of abandonment. The island, once her home, now felt like a prison. The villagers who had once smiled kindly at her as she passed now seemed to whisper behind her back. Their eyes would linger on her a little too long, filled with something that resembled pity or perhaps suspicion. She could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on her whenever she walked through the village square, their whispers like 1,000 tiny knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. "Do you think he'll come back?" One old woman murmured to another as Huynh passed by. "I doubt it," the other replied, her voice a hiss. "He's probably found someone else by now, a prettier, wealthier girl. Why would he come back to this wretched island?" Huynh pretended not to hear, but the words burrowed into her mind, festering like an infection. Was it true? Had Tam found someone else? Had he forgotten about her entirely? She would sit by the shore for hours, staring out at the water, waiting for any sign of his return. The sea was vast and endless, its dark waves lapping against the shore with a steady rhythm, as if mocking her for her foolishness. The wind carried the scent of salt and decay, and the longer she waited, the more the island seemed to close in around her. The once beautiful landscape now felt oppressive, as though the very earth was conspiring against her. And then the whispers began not just from the villagers but from the island itself. At night, as Huynh lay in her small bed, the wind would whistle through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it voices soft, distant, but unmistakable. "He's never coming back, you've been abandoned, betrayed," Huynh would cover her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they were relentless, whispering from the shadows, seeping into her dreams. She saw Tam in those dreams, standing on the mainland, his back turned to her. No matter how much she called out to him, he never turned around. He never looked at her. The distance between them grew, the fog thickening, until he was swallowed by it entirely, leaving her alone in the cold. The island seemed to grow more hostile with each passing day. The trees that lined the forest path seemed darker, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, as if they would grab hold of her if she ventured too close. The animals, once so abundant, were disappearing, and there was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension that weighed down on everything. It was as if the island itself was mourning something, or perhaps waiting for something terrible to happen. But Huygh's once bright spirit began to fade, consumed by the isolation and the uncertainty that had taken root in her heart. She had no answers, no news from Tam, nothing to hold on to except the memories of what they had shared. But memories weren't enough. They couldn't fill the growing void inside her, the one that whispered darker and darker thoughts as the days wore on. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world was swallowed by twilight, Huynh sat by the shore, staring out at the water. The mist was thick that night, rolling in off the sea like a shroud, and as she gazed into the distance, she thought she saw something, a figure, faint and distant, standing on the edge of the fog. "Tam," she whispered, her heart leaping with hope for the first time in weeks. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, motionless, watching her. As the mist swirled around it, Huynh felt a chill crawl up her spine. There was something wrong. The figure, whoever it was too still, too silent, and the air around it seemed off. The shadows clung to it, wrapping it in darkness, until it was little more than an outline against the fog. Huynh blinked, and the figure was gone. Her heart raced in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She stood, her legs trembling beneath her. Was it Tam? Or was it something else, something darker? She didn't know anymore. The island was playing tricks on her, warping her mind, feeding her fears. She turned and hurried back to the village, the wind howling behind her, as if urging her to run faster, to escape. But no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't outrun the feeling that had taken root deep in her soul, the feeling that Tam was never coming back, and that something far worse was waiting for her in the shadows. The whispers grew louder as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months. Huynh's faith in Tam's return was tested again and again, until it became nothing more than a fragile thread, stretched thin and fraying at the edges. And as the whispers of betrayal echoed through the village, seeping into every corner of her mind, Huynh began to wonder if perhaps they were right. Perhaps Tam had abandoned her after all. Part 4. Discovery of Betrayal. The wind on Kulau Island howled with a mournful wail, as if it were carrying the cries of lost souls across the barren shores. Huynh sat by the sea, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the mist seemed to curl and twist like a living thing. It had been over a year since Tam had left, promising to return, to bring fortune back with him. She had waited, patiently, faithfully. But the weight of his absence had grown heavier with each passing day, until it felt like a stone lodged in her chest, pressing against her heart with an unbearable ache. The whispers had started months ago, hushed voices in the village, eyes filled with pity whenever Huynh passed by. He's forgotten her, they said. He's found someone else. She had dismissed them at first, clinging to Tam's promise that he would come back for her. But the doubt had crept in slowly, like a shadow, until it consumed her thoughts. The island had a way of amplifying fear, of feeding the darkness that lay dormant in every heart. And now, as Huynh sat in the suffocating silence of the shore, she couldn't ignore the whispers any longer. It was on a cold, grey morning that the news reached her word of a grand wedding taking place in the city on the mainland. The villagers spoke of it with excitement, their voices tinged with awe as they described the lavish preparations, the opulence, and the beauty of the bride. But it wasn't the bride that caught Huyhn's attention. It was the name of the groom, Tam. The name fell like a hammer on her heart, shattering the fragile hope she had been holding on to. For a moment, the world around her seemed to blur, her vision narrowing until all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. Tam, her Tam, the man she had waited for, longed for, dreamt of, was getting married to someone else. A cold dread settled over her, tightening around her chest like a vice. She couldn't breathe. The whispers had been true. The betrayal she had feared, the dark seed of doubt that had grown inside her, was real. Tam had abandoned her. He had left her on this desolate island to rot in her loneliness while he built a new life for himself with another woman. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to cry. Not yet. Not until she had seen it for herself. She couldn't let herself believe it until the truth was laid bare before her. Without another word, without saying goodbye to anyone, Huynh gathered what little she had and set off for the mainland. The journey was grueling. The boat ride across the sea was rough, the waves crashing against the small vessel as if trying to stop her from reaching her destination. But Huyhn's resolve was stronger than the sea's fury. She sat in silence, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. The cold spray of the ocean did nothing to cool the burning rage and sorrow that twisted inside her. When she finally arrived in the city, the world seemed to close in around her. The streets were bustling with life, people laughing and talking, oblivious to the storm brewing in Huyhn's heart. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, her eyes scanning every face, every shop window, every street corner, searching for some sign of Tam. And then she heard it, the sound of celebration, of music, of laughter, carried on the wind from a grand estate at the edge of the city. Her heart pounded in her chest as she followed the sound, her footsteps quickening with each passing moment. She could feel the bile rising in her throat, the dread curling tighter around her. She didn't want to believe it, but the closer she got to the estate, the more certain she became. This was it. This was the place. The estate loomed before her, a grand building draped in flowers and silk, glowing with the soft light of hundreds of lanterns. Guests were gathered outside, dressed in their finest clothes, their faces alight with joy. Huynh stood at the gates, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the scene before her. And then she saw him, Tam. He was standing at the entrance to the estate, dressed in fine robes, a wide smile on his face as he greeted the guests. He looked different, more polished, more confident, like a man who had found his place in the world. But it was him, her Tam. Her Tam. Huynh's heart twisted painfully in her chest. She wanted to scream, to call out his name, to run to him and demand an explanation. But her feet remained rooted to the spot, her voice caught in her throat. She watched in silent horror as Tam turned, his arm extending toward the woman beside him. The bride. She was beautiful with dark, flowing hair and a radiant smile that could light up the darkest room. She was everything Huynh was not: wealthy, graceful, untouched by the hardships of life on Kyu-Lao. And as Tam took her hand, as he led her into the estate, Huynh felt something inside her shatter. She couldn't breathe. The world around her spun, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. This was real. This was happening. Tam had moved on. He had forgotten about her, about their love, about the life they had planned together. He had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. Huyhn's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the cold stone path, her body trembling as sobs racked her frame. She covered her face with her hands, unable to bear the sight of the man she loved with another woman. The pain was too much, too raw, like a knife twisting in her heart. For a long time she remained there, broken and alone, as the sounds of celebration filled the air. She wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but there was nothing left inside her. She was hollow, her spirit crushed beneath the weight of Tam's betrayal. When the night finally fell and the guests began to leave, Huynh forced herself to her feet. Her legs were weak, her body numb, but she had to get away. She had to leave this place, this city, this nightmare that had become her reality. She couldn't bear to be here any longer, to see the life that Tam had built without her. With what little strength she had left, she turned and walked away, her footsteps slow and heavy, as she made her way back to the docks. The journey back to Kyu-Lao was a blur of pain and darkness. The sea was merciless, tossing the boat as if it were nothing more than a toy in the hands of a cruel child. But Huynh welcomed the storm. She welcomed the cold, the wind, the rain that lashed against her skin. It was better than the numbness that had taken hold of her heart. When she finally returned to the island, it was as if she was stepping into a different world. The once familiar shores felt alien, the trees and rocks twisted into strange shapes by the shadows that clung to them. The island had always been lonely, but now it felt suffocating, as if the very earth was conspiring to trap her here forever. Huynh wandered the island in a daze, her mind consumed by the betrayal that had ripped her life apart. She no longer felt like the girl who had once dreamed of a future with Tam, who had waited faithfully for his return. That girl was gone, replaced by someone hollow, someone who no longer believed in hope or love. The villagers noticed the change in her. They whispered behind her back, their voices laced with pity and fear. "She's broken," they said. Tam broke her, but Huynh didn't care. She no longer cared about anything. The world had become a cold, empty place, devoid of the warmth and joy she had once known. The only thing that remained was the darkness, the deep, unrelenting darkness that had settled over her soul. She returned to the small house she had once shared with Tam, the place where they had made promises to each other, where they had dreamed of a life together. But the house was no longer a home, it was a tomb filled with the ghosts of memories that haunted her every step. At night she would lie awake, listening to the wind as it whispered through the cracks in the walls. The voices were louder now, more insistent, more malicious, betrayed, abandoned, forgotten. Huynh would cover her ears, but the voices were inside her head, inescapable. They whispered of revenge, of anger, of the injustice that had been done to her. And slowly, as the days turned into weeks, she began to listen. The woman who had once loved Tam, who had waited for him with an open heart, was gone. In her place was someone darker, someone colder, someone who no longer believed in the light. All that remained was the bitterness, the anger, and the deep, burning need for retribution. The island seemed to understand her pain. The trees, the wind, the sea, they all whispered to her now, comforting her with their dark, ancient voices. They told her that she wasn't alone, that the island itself had been betrayed, abandoned by the ones who had once loved it. And together they would make things right. Huynh was no longer afraid of the darkness. It had become her only companion, her only solace. She had been betrayed, yes, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. And as the island's shadows grew longer, as the nights grew colder, she made a silent vow. Tam would pay for what he had done. And when the time came, she would make sure he never forgot. Part 5. Huynh's illness and isolation. The air on Chiulau Island seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, as though the very atmosphere had thickened with sorrow and dread. The sky, once a brilliant blue that stretched endlessly over the ocean, was now a muted grey, cloaking the island in a constant gloom. The sun barely penetrated the clouds, casting long shadows that slithered across the ground like dark spirits. And at the center of this growing darkness was Huynh. After her return from the mainland, something inside Huynh had changed. Her once vibrant spirit had withered, her once sparkling eyes now dull and lifeless. She wandered the island like a ghost, her mind and body consumed by the weight of betrayal. The villagers who had once smiled kindly at her now avoided her with furtive glances. There was something about her now, something unsettling that they couldn't quite name. At first it was small things that the villagers noticed. Huynh, who had always been so polite and gentle, stopped speaking altogether. Her once warm greetings were replaced by a hollow silence, and her presence seemed to draw a chill wherever she went. Her health too began to decline rapidly. Her face grew pale, her skin stretched thin over her bones, and dark circles appeared beneath her eyes, making her look more like a spectre than the girl they had known. She no longer ate, no longer cared for herself, and each day her frail form seemed to fade further away. The island, always eerie with its dense forests and mist-shrouded shores, now felt as though it too was decaying along with Huynh. The trees seemed more twisted, their branches like gnarled hands reaching out to snatch the unwary. The once calming waves that lapped against the shore now roared with an unsettling ferocity. Even the animals usually seen darting through the underbrush had become scarce. It was as if the island itself had become infected with the same sickness that had overtaken Huynh. She withdrew further and further from the world, locking herself away in the small house where she and Tam had once lived together. The house, which had once been filled with laughter and love, now stood silent and cold, its walls closing in on her like a tomb. The shadows inside seemed to lengthen, swallowing the light that tried to filter through the windows. At night the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it voices soft, distant, but filled with malice. Betrayed, abandoned, forgotten, they whispered. Huynh would lie in her bed, trembling beneath the thin blankets, her body racked with fever. She knew the whispers weren't real, knew they were just the echoes of her shattered mind, but they were relentless, gnawing at her sanity, sinking their claws deeper into her with each passing night. She could no longer tell where the whispers ended and her own thoughts began. Her isolation became complete when she stopped venturing out of the house altogether. Weeks passed without her stepping foot outside. The villagers, growing more concerned but also more afraid, stopped visiting. At first they had tried to help. They had brought her food, though she barely touched it. They had offered kind words, though she didn't seem to hear them. But as her illness worsened, they began to fear her. There was something unnatural about her sickness, something that went beyond the physical. It was as if the island itself had cursed her, as if it was feeding on her misery. Inside the house, Huynh's world had become small and suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on her, pressing down like an invisible force. Her heart, already broken by Tam's betrayal, was now heavy with something darker. It wasn't just sorrow anymore, it was anger, it was despair, it was a deep, consuming hatred. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a burning, festering thing that refused to be extinguished. It twisted and coiled inside her like a serpent, poisoning her thoughts. She could no longer sleep through the night. When she closed her eyes, the darkness was filled with nightmares, visions of Tam, standing with his new bride, his back turned to her, unreachable. In these dreams she would call out to him, but he would never turn around. He never even acknowledged her presence, as though she were nothing more than a ghost already forgotten. And when she would wake, drenched in sweat, the whispers would return, louder now, more insistent. Forgotten, abandoned, left to die, her body was failing her. She could feel it with every labored breath, with every step that grew more difficult. Her bones ached, her muscles weakened, and even standing for too long left her dizzy and gasping for air. Her hair, once long and lustrous, now fell out in clumps, leaving her withered and fragile, a shell of the woman she once was. But worse than the physical decay was the mental torment. The island seemed to be alive, watching her, feeding off her suffering. The shadows in her home moved when she wasn't looking, creeping along the walls like black tendrils, closing in on her. She could hear the island whispering to her now, not just the voices in her head, but something deeper, something older. It called to her, beckoning her into the darkness, promising relief from the pain, from the anguish that gnawed at her soul. She could feel it in the very earth beneath her feet, a pulsing, malevolent energy that wrapped around her like a shroud. The island had become a living, breathing entity, and it wanted her. It wanted her despair, her grief, her hatred. It wanted her to surrender to the darkness completely. But Huynh resisted, clinging desperately to the last vestiges of her humanity, even as they slipped through her fingers like sand. She had nothing left, no family, no love, no future, but she refused to give in to the island's whispers. Not yet. She wasn't ready to die, not like this, not in this house, alone and forgotten. She wasn't ready to become another victim of the island's curse. The days bled into each other, a blur of pain and fever. She spent most of her time in bed now, too weak to move, too weak to care. The fever had taken hold of her completely, and she could feel her mind slipping further and further into madness. The dreams became more vivid, more terrifying. She would see Tam in her dreams, but he was no longer the man she loved. He had become something else, something monstrous. His face, once so familiar and beloved, was twisted and grotesque, his eyes hollow and black. He would reach for her, his hands cold and clammy, but when he touched her, her skin would burn, searing with an unbearable heat. She would wake from these dreams screaming, her throat raw, her body drenched in sweat. And then the whispers would come, hissing through the cracks in the walls, crawling into her ears like insects. You will die here, alone, forgotten. One night the fever broke for a brief moment, and in that moment of clarity, Huynh realized something terrifying. She was truly alone. No one was coming for her. Tam had abandoned her, the villagers had forsaken her, and now even the island had turned against her. There was no one left to save her, no one left to care. Her body trembled with the realization, her heart aching with a pain that went beyond the physical. She was nothing now, just a hollow shell, consumed by her own grief. She could feel the darkness creeping closer, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. It whispered to her, promised her peace, promised her an end to the pain. All she had to do was give in. All she had to do was let go. But Huynh wasn't ready to let go, not yet. She dragged herself out of bed, her legs weak and trembling beneath her, and stumbled to the window. The sky was dark, the moon obscured by thick clouds, casting the island in an eerie, almost otherworldly light. The sea roared in the distance, its waves crashing against the shore with a ferocity that matched the storm brewing inside her. For a long time she stood there, staring out at the horizon, at the distant shore where Tam had disappeared all those months ago. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he ever felt even a fraction of the pain she was enduring. But deep down she knew the truth. He had moved on, he had forgotten her. And now she was nothing more than a memory, fading into the past, as forgotten as the island itself. With a trembling hand, Huynh reached up to touch the cold glass of the window, her reflection staring back at her. She barely recognized herself. The woman in the glass was a stranger, gaunt, hollow, eyes sunken and filled with despair. She was no longer Huynh. She was something else, something darker, something that had been twisted and broken by betrayal and loneliness. And in that moment, as she gazed at the stranger in the glass, she knew what she had to do. She had to let go. She had to let go. She had to surrender to the island, to the darkness that had been calling to her for so long. It was the only way to escape the pain, the only way to find peace. The whispers were right. She would die here, alone, forgotten. But not without a reckoning. With one last glance at the horizon, Huynh turned away from the window and retreated into the shadows of the house, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. The island had taken everything from her, her love, her future, her very soul. And now it was time for her to give it what it wanted, her life. As the wind howled outside, carrying with it the mournful cries of the sea, Huynh disappeared into the darkness, her final breath hanging in the air like a ghost, lost to the island's cursed winds. Part 6. The haunting begins. When Tam finally set foot on the familiar shores of Kulau Island, a heavy sense of unease washed over him. The air felt different, colder, as if the island had been waiting for his return. The once warm, sun-soaked sands now seemed bleak and barren, and the village that had always bustled with life felt eerily quiet. The waves lapped against the shore, but their sound was muted, almost distant, as though the sea itself were holding its breath. Tam couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had been away far longer than he had promised. What was meant to be a few months on the mainland had stretched into over a year, an entire year, in which his life had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The bustling city had pulled him in with its promises of wealth and opportunity, and Tam had found himself swept up in a life he had never imagined. He had made connections, found success, and yes, fallen in love with another woman. A woman who was everything Huynh was not: wealthy, sophisticated, someone who could offer him the future he desired. But now, standing on the shores of the island he had once called home, Tam felt none of the pride or satisfaction he had expected. Instead, there was only a deep, gnawing dread, as though the island itself was watching him, waiting for him to step deeper into its shadows. The villagers greeted him with weary eyes, their expressions veiled with something he couldn't quite place: pity perhaps, or was it fear? They spoke little, their voices hushed, and no one mentioned Huynh. Tam had expected questions about why he had been gone for so long, or why he had broken his promise to marry her, but the silence was far more unsettling than any confrontation would have been. As he made his way through the village toward his old house, a cold wind swept across the island, rattling the palm trees and sending a chill down his spine. The closer he got to the house, the darker the world around him seemed to grow. The shadows lengthened, twisting and curling like dark tendrils along the ground, reaching out toward him as if trying to pull him back. He shuddered, shaking off the feeling of being watched, but it clung to him, a weight he couldn't shrug off. The house loomed before him, its once familiar facade now draped in decay. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the wind. Tam hesitated at the threshold, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence inside was oppressive, as though the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for his return. The moment he stepped inside, the cold hit him like a physical force. It wasn't just the chill of the night air, this cold was unnatural, a biting, bone-deep frost that seemed to seep into his very soul. He could feel it in his bones, in the marrow of his spine. The house smelled of damp and rot, as if it had been abandoned for years, though he knew that Huynh had lived here alone after he left. Huynh. Her name echoed in his mind, and with it came a wave of guilt so strong it nearly knocked him off his feet. He had abandoned her, left her here to wither away while he built a new life elsewhere. And for what? Wealth? Status? The very things he had sought now felt hollow, meaningless in the face of the cold, desolate reality of the island. Tam shook his head, trying to rid himself of the rising guilt. He had made his choices, and there was no undoing them now. He had to move forward, had to settle his affairs here before he could leave the island for good. But even as he told himself this, a soft whisper echoed through the house, a sound so faint, so fleeting, that he almost believed he had imagined it. Tam. The voice was barely audible, a breath carried on the wind, but it sent a jolt of terror through him. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned sharply, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. There was no one there. Of course there was no one, but the house didn't feel empty, not at all. He tried to shake it off, attributing the voice to his overactive imagination, but as the night wore on, the whispers became more frequent, more distinct. They would come at the edges of his consciousness, just as he was drifting off to sleep, pulling him back into a state of panicked wakefulness. Tam. You left me. The voice was unmistakable now, soft, mournful, filled with sorrow and accusation. It was Huynh. It was her voice calling out to him from the shadows, from the depths of the house. And no matter how many times he told himself it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real, the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Tam, why did you leave me? The cold in the house seemed to intensify with each passing hour, until it was unbearable. Tam's breath came out in visible puffs, and his skin prickled with goosebumps. He piled on blankets, lit a fire, but nothing could shake the freezing chill that clung to him. And the whispers followed him everywhere. When he ventured outside to clear his mind, the shadows seemed to follow him. The villagers avoided him now, their eyes wide with fear whenever he passed. The sea breeze, once refreshing, now felt like icy fingers brushing against his skin, and the wind seemed to carry Huynh's voice wherever he went. At night, the nightmares began. They were vivid, relentless, each one more horrifying than the last. In his dreams, Huynh would appear, her eyes hollow, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. She would stand at the foot of his bed, her mouth twisted into a silent scream, her eyes fixed on him with a look of pure anguish. In some dreams she would reach out to him, her hands cold and skeletal, her touch like ice on his skin. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, his body trembling with fear. But even in the waking world, the nightmare didn't end. The house had become a prison of shadows and whispers. No matter where he went, he felt her presence. He could hear her footsteps behind him, soft and deliberate, always just out of sight. When he turned, there would be nothing, just the empty room, the flickering shadows, and the suffocating cold. But he knew she was there, watching him, waiting. One night, as Tam sat by the fire, trying to calm his frayed nerves, he felt the temperature in the room drop suddenly. The flames flickered and dimmed, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. His breath hitched in his throat as the whispering began again, this time closer, clearer than ever. Tam, you betrayed me. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles white. He could feel her now, standing just behind him. He didn't dare turn around, didn't dare look. The air was thick with her presence, with the weight of her sorrow and anger. Suddenly the fire went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Tam's heart raced, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He could hear her breathing now slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. In the pitch-black darkness, something cold brushed against the back of his neck, sending a jolt of terror through his body. He leapt from his chair, stumbling backward, his hands reaching for anything to steady himself. His heart pounded in his chest, and his vision swam with fear. The room was silent now, but the presence remained heavy and suffocating. He was not alone. For the first time since he had returned to the island, Tam felt true, bone-deep fear. He had tried to ignore the guilt, had tried to push aside the whispers, but now he couldn't escape it. Huynh was here. Her ghost, her spirit, her anger, it was all here, haunting him, tormenting him for what he had done. In the days that followed, Tam's condition worsened. He could no longer sleep, the nightmares blurring into reality. He would see Huynh's face in every shadow, hear her voice in every gust of wind. The house had become a maze of horrors, each room more oppressive than the last. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air thick with cold and sorrow. And always he could feel her watching him, waiting for him to acknowledge her presence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the island in a blood-red glow, Tam stood at the edge of the cliffs, staring out at the sea. The wind howled around him, the waves crashing violently against the rocks below. He could feel her there, just behind him, her presence cold and heavy. Tam, the voice was soft but filled with a deep, aching sorrow. "Why did you leave me?" He closed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no answer, no excuse. The truth was simple: he had abandoned her, betrayed her, and now she was making him pay. He could feel the weight of her gaze on his back, the coldness of her presence seeping into his bones. The wind roared, and with it came the sound of her voice, louder this time, filled with a fury that shook him to his core. "You left me to die." Tam staggered forward, his legs weak, his mind spinning. The guilt, the fear, it was all too much. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The shadows danced around him, the sea roared below, and the cold, unrelenting presence of Huynh wrapped around him like a vice. And in that moment, as the darkness closed in around him, Tam knew one thing for certain: there was no escaping her, not now, not ever. Part 7. A terrifying confrontation. It was the dead of night, and Kulo Island was wrapped in a heavy silence, the kind that pressed against your skin and sank deep into your bones. Not a single sound could be heard, no wind to rustle the leaves, no waves crashing against the shore. The night was unnaturally still, suffocating, as though the island itself were holding its breath in anticipation. Inside his old, decaying house, Tam sat by the dying embers of the hearth, his mind restless, his body heavy with exhaustion. His eyes, bloodshot from countless sleepless nights, darted to every flicker of the shadows that seemed to creep closer with each passing moment. He had not known peace since his return. Every night had been plagued by nightmares, by the cold, the whispers, and the feeling of eyes unseen but ever present watching him. The haunting presence of Huynh clung to him like a second skin, suffocating him in guilt and fear. Tonight, though, something was different. The air was colder, sharper, as though the temperature had dropped to freezing within the house itself. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, denser, pulsing with a life of their own. There was a weight to the silence, a palpable tension that made Tam's skin prickle with unease. Then it came a sound, faint at first but unmistakable, a soft, barely audible whisper, like the rustle of silk across the floor. Tam froze, his breath caught in his throat, his heart hammering in his chest. He had heard this before, the beginning of something terrible. Tam, her voice drifted through the room, a mournful, sorrowful sound that sent a chill racing down his spine. It was Huynh. He knew it before he even turned to look. She was here. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows tightening around him like a noose. The temperature dropped further, making his breath come out in short, visible puffs. He could feel her, closer now, the air thick with her presence. Slowly, with dread pooling in his stomach, Tam turned to face the source of the voice. There, standing in the doorway, was Huynh, but this was not the Huynh he had once known. The woman standing before him was a ghostly, pale figure, her once beautiful face now drawn and gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark, voids where life had once shimmered. Her long black hair hung limply around her, dripping with an unseen dampness that clung to her white dress, which fluttered as though caught in an invisible breeze. She stood still, her bare feet hovering just above the ground, and her eyes, those empty, sorrowful eyes, were fixed on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Tam's breath hitched in his throat, his heart racing wildly. His mind screamed at him to flee, to get as far away from her as possible, but his body refused to move. He was frozen in place, rooted to the spot by sheer terror. This was no dream. This was real. Huynh's ghost had come for him, and there was no escaping her now. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. Huynh simply stared at him, her face twisted in an expression of sorrow, so deep it seemed to bleed into the very air around her. But beneath that sorrow, Tam could feel the sharp edge of something darker, something cold, vengeful, and relentless. "Why, Tam," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with an unbearable sadness. "Why did you betray me?" Her words cut through the air like a knife, slicing through the fragile silence. Tam's chest tightened, his throat dry, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. He wanted to answer, wanted to explain himself, but no words came. All he could do was stare at her, his mind swirling with guilt and fear. Huyhn's eyes darkened, the sorrow giving way to something far more menacing. She took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate, her feet still hovering inches above the ground. The temperature plummeted further, and the room was plunged into an icy cold so intense that Tam's breath crystallized in the air. "You left me." Huyhn's voice was barely above a whisper, but it echoed in the room, reverberating in Tam's skull. "You promised. But you left me to die." Each word seemed to grow heavier, colder, pressing against Tam's chest like an unbearable weight. He could feel the blood draining from his face, his heart pounding furiously as panic set in. His muscles tensed, and finally his body obeyed the desperate commands of his mind. He bolted. Without thinking, Tam sprang to his feet and ran for the door, his legs trembling beneath him. His pulse thudded in his ears, and all he could think about was escape. He had to get away. He had to get out of the house, away from her, away from the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. But as he reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, as if an unseen force had thrown it closed. Tam skidded to a halt, his heart leaping into his throat. He frantically grabbed the handle, pulling and yanking with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had been sealed shut by the very air around it. Behind him, Huyhn's presence grew closer, her icy breath brushing against the back of his neck. He could feel the cold radiating from her, could feel her sorrow, her rage clawing at his back. "You cannot run from me, Tam." Her voice was closer now, right behind him, sending shivers down his spine. "You will pay for what you've done." Tam's chest heaved with panicked breaths. Desperation clawed at him, and he slammed his fists against the door, trying to force it open. But it was no use. The door remained stubbornly closed, as though the house itself had trapped him inside with her. Tears of terror welled in his eyes as he turned to face her once more, his back pressed against the door. Huynh hovered just feet away, her dark, hollow eyes fixed on him, unblinking. Her once beautiful features were twisted with grief and fury, her ghostly figure flickering in the dim light like a candle on the verge of being snuffed out. Tam's voice cracked as he finally spoke, his words spilling out in a desperate plea. "I'm sorry, Huynh. I'm so sorry. Please, forgive me." But there was no forgiveness in her eyes, only cold, merciless rage. "Sorry," she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. You think sorry can undo the pain, the suffering, the loneliness? What? Her figure flickered violently, and with a rush of cold wind she lunged forward, her hands outstretched toward him. Tam's body tensed in terror, and he tried to push himself further back against the door, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped. Her cold, skeletal fingers brushed against his chest, sending a wave of icy pain through his body. It was as though her touch drained the very warmth from his soul, leaving him frozen, paralyzed with fear. Tam gasped, his breath coming in ragged, uneven gulps as her grip tightened, her fingers pressing against his heart. "You will feel my pain," she whispered, her voice now filled with a venomous fury. "You will know what it's like to be abandoned, to be left to die alone." The shadows in the room seemed to close in around them, swirling like a storm of darkness. Tam's vision blurred as the cold seeped deeper into his bones, and he could feel his heartbeat slowing, his strength draining away. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but his voice was lost to the suffocating cold. Huygh's face hovered just inches from his, her empty, hollow eyes burning into his soul. Her lips curled into a twisted smile, a smile filled with malice and vengeance. "You will pay, Tam," she whispered. "You will pay." With a final surge of desperation, Tam wrenched himself away from her grasp, stumbling backward into the door. His entire body shook with fear, his limbs weak and trembling. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with panic. He had to escape. He had to get away from her before it was too late. With trembling hands he fumbled with the door handle once more, and to his astonishment it gave way. The door flew open with a creaking groan, and Tam tumbled out into the night, gasping for breath. He ran, his legs unsteady, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All that mattered was getting as far away from the house, from her, as possible. The night air was cold against his skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy touch of Henny's ghost. As he ran, her voice echoed in his ears, louder now, filled with a fury that made his blood run cold. "You will pay, you will pay." The words followed him, relentless, unyielding, as though they were woven into the very fabric of the night. No matter how far he ran, no matter how fast, her voice remained with him, chasing him through the darkness. Tam's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion. His legs burned, his muscles screamed, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not with her chasing him, not with her vengeful spirit haunting his every step. He glanced back, his heart leaping into his throat as he saw her pale, ghostly figure floating behind him, her eyes burning with hatred. She was faster than him, closing the distance with terrifying ease, her hands outstretched, ready to drag him into the abyss. "You cannot escape me, Tam," she whispered, her voice like ice. "Your soul is mine." Tam stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he fell to the ground with a cry of pain. He scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking, but it was too late. She was upon him. Her cold hands gripped his shoulders, and Tam let out a scream filled with terror, regret, and the horrifying realization that he could not escape. Huynh leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear, her voice barely more than a breath. "You will pay." Part 8. Tam's Demise. The night had turned colder than Tam could ever remember, colder than anything he had felt in his entire life. It was a bone-deep chill that clung to his very soul, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. His feet pounded against the soft earth of the island as he ran, wild and desperate, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every corner he turned, every tree he passed seemed to close in on him, suffocating him beneath the weight of the night. The darkness wrapped around him like an unforgiving shroud, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was always just behind him. Huynh, her name pulsed in his mind, filling his thoughts with dread. He couldn't escape her, not now, not ever. Her cold voice still echoed in his ears, mingling with the rustle of the trees and the distant crash of waves along the shore. "You will pay." It was a promise, a curse, one that would haunt him until the end. His legs were trembling, his heart pounding, as if it would burst from his chest. He had been running for what felt like hours, though he had no sense of time. The island had become a maze of shadows and whispered accusations, twisting and turning until he no longer recognized where he was. The once familiar paths now seemed foreign and treacherous. He stumbled over roots, his feet slipping on the wet ground. But he didn't dare stop. Stopping meant facing what he had done. In his panic, he finally reached the shore, the edge of the island where the sea met the land. The moonlight, pale and ghostly, cast a faint silver glow on the waves that lapped gently against the rocks. It should have been peaceful, but tonight it was anything but. The ocean seemed to roar in his ears, as if it, too, knew what was about to happen. Tam collapsed to his knees, his body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The salty air stung his lungs as he gasped for breath, his chest heaving uncontrollably. His vision blurred, his mind racing, but all he could see, all he could feel was her. She was close. He didn't need to look to know that she was there, standing just behind him, her presence cold and suffocating, as if the very air around her had been stripped of life. He could feel the chill radiating from her, sinking into his skin, freezing him from the inside out. Huynh, he gasped, his voice broken, barely more than a whisper. Please, please forgive me. There was no answer. Only the sound of the wind, the waves, and his own frantic heartbeat. I didn't mean to leave you, he choked, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the salt of the sea. I didn't know. I didn't think, but the words felt hollow, even to him. He had known. Deep down, he had always known what he had done, the betrayal that had sealed his fate. He had abandoned her, forgotten her, and now she had returned to claim what was owed. Slowly, painfully, Tam turned to face her. She stood before him, pale and ethereal, her long, black hair hanging like a veil around her face. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, were now dark and hollow, empty of any emotion but one: vengeance. The wind tugged at her white dress, making it flutter as if she were weightless, a ghost bound to the island and to the man who had betrayed her. Her face was a mask of sorrow, twisted by the agony she had endured, and yet there was something deeply terrifying in the stillness of her features, in the way she watched him with those empty, accusing eyes. Tam's breath caught in his throat, his heart hammering wildly. He crawled backward, his hands scrambling against the rocky shore, but there was nowhere to go. The ocean stretched endlessly behind him, and Huynh stood in front of him, her form shimmering in the moonlight like a terrible, beautiful spectre. There was no escape, not this time. Huynh, please, he begged, his voice shaking, his eyes wide with terror. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. For a moment there was silence. Then she stepped forward. Her movement was slow, deliberate, as if each step was laced with the weight of the betrayal that had condemned her. Tam watched in horror as she came closer, his body trembling uncontrollably. The air around her seemed to freeze it, and with each step she took, the cold deepened, biting at his skin, making it harder to breathe. Sorry, her voice was a soft, venomous hiss, barely louder than the wind, but it echoed in his mind like a death knell. Sorry won't bring me back. Tam's eyes burned with cold fury, the edges of her form flickering like a candle in a storm. She reached out a hand toward him, her fingers long and thin, like the brittle branches of a dead tree. Tam recoiled, but it was no use. The coldness of her touch was already upon him, creeping through the air, crawling up his spine, seeping into his bones. You left me to die, she whispered, her voice growing louder, sharper. You left me. Alone, Tam's chest tightened, a sob tearing from his throat. I didn't mean to. You did, she screamed, her voice suddenly sharp and filled with rage, reverberating through the night like thunder. You abandoned me. You betrayed me. Her words cut through him like shards of ice, each one sharper, colder than the last. The guilt, the fear, it all crashed down on him in that moment, and he realized with horrifying clarity that there would be no forgiveness, no mercy. Please, he whimpered, his voice breaking, barely audible above the roar of the sea. Please don't, but Huynh was done listening. Her hand, icy and ghostly, closed around his throat. Tam gasped. his eyes wide with terror as the freezing cold of her touch spread through his body like poison. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, his heart pounding against his ribs. He clawed at her hand, but there was no substance to her. His fingers passed right through, as though she were made of nothing but mist and shadows. Yet her grip tightened. The coldness seeped deeper, spreading from his throat down to his chest, to his limbs, until it felt as if the very life was being drained from him. His vision blurred, dark spots creeping in from the edges, and his lungs burned with the effort to breathe. His body convulsed, his muscles twitching uncontrollably as the ice settled deep in his bones. Huynh's face hovered just inches from his, her dark eyes fixed on his with a terrifying intensity. There was no mercy there, no love, only the cold, unrelenting fury of a soul that had been wronged. "You will pay, Tam," she whispered, her voice low and deadly. "You will pay with your life." Tam's body shuddered, his breath rasping painfully in his throat. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His hands, once frantically clawing at her, fell limp at his sides. The world around him seemed to blur, the shadows growing darker, the cold deeper. He could hear his heartbeat slowing, feel his body growing heavy, as if the weight of his betrayal was finally pulling him under. And then there was nothing. The last thing Tam saw before the darkness claimed him was Huyhnh's face, pale, cold and vengeful, her eyes burning with an unholy light. When the sun finally rose over Kulau Island, casting its warm, golden light over the sleepy village, it revealed a grim sight. Tam's body was found by the shore, sprawled on the rocks, his limbs twisted unnaturally. His skin was pale, almost blue, as though the life had been drained from him, and his face was frozen in a mask of pure terror, his eyes wide and glassy, his mouth open in a silent scream. The villagers gathered around the body, whispering in hushed tones, their eyes filled with fear. No one knew what had happened, but the look on Tam's face told them all they needed to know. He had seen something terrible, something that had taken him in the night. And now he was gone, his life claimed by the very ghost he had once loved and betrayed. The sea lapped gently at the shore, the wind carrying with it the faintest whisper, like a voice lost to the waves. "You will pay," and Tam had. Part 9. The Curse of Betrayal. The island of Kulau had always been quiet, its shores a sanctuary from the storms that raged in the seas beyond. But after that night, the island's silence took on a different meaning, an oppressive, suffocating stillness that wrapped around the village like a shroud. The air seemed heavier, colder, as though even nature itself had sensed the malevolent presence that now haunted the island. The villagers spoke in whispers, their eyes always glancing toward the shore, as though they expected to see her standing there watching, waiting. Huyhnh's death had not been the end. It was merely the beginning. The day they found Tam's body, twisted and cold by the shoreline, the people knew something terrible had happened. They didn't speak of it directly, no one dared to, yet they all understood. Tam's death wasn't natural. It wasn't some accident or misfortune. It was punishment. The story of Huyhnh's betrayal by Tam spread quickly among the villagers, carried on the hushed voices of those who had witnessed the change in Tam upon his return. People had seen him walking the village paths, his eyes hollow and haunted, his steps unsteady, as though he carried a burden too great to bear. They had heard him talking to himself, his voice low and frantic, as if he were speaking to someone who wasn't there. He had become a man consumed by fear of the past he could not escape, and now he was dead. The once proud families of Huynh and Tam were left in ruins. The Tams who had placed so much hope in their son now grieved not only for his death but for the shame he had brought upon them. His betrayal had not just destroyed his own life but had unraveled the bonds that had once tied the two families together. Huyhnh's family, left with no one to carry on their name, had been plunged into despair, their grief turning the air in their home cold and bitter. But even in death, Huynh was not at peace. Her spirit remained tethered to the island by the betrayal that had torn her life apart. The villagers could feel her presence in the wind that swept across the shore at night, in the sudden chills that crept through the air, in the way the shadows seemed to lengthen and shift when dusk settled. Chu Lao, once a peaceful refuge, had become a place of lingering dread. It started with small things. Fishermen, returning from their late-night hauls, would speak of seeing a figure standing by the shore, pale and still, her long black hair swaying in the wind. At first they thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moon or the waves. But then they would see her again night after night, always in the same spot, always watching. Some claimed that they saw her face a face twisted with sorrow and rage, eyes black and empty like the depths of the sea. Others swore they heard her whispering, calling out in a voice so faint that it seemed to blend with the sound of the ocean. The story spread, and soon no one dared to go near the shore at night. The once popular gathering spot for village festivals and celebrations became a place to avoid, a cursed location where Huyhn's ghost was said to walk, forever searching for the man who had betrayed her. But it wasn't just the shoreline that felt her presence. The entire island seemed infected by her lingering spirit. Doors would slam shut in the middle of the night, even when there was no wind. Candles would flicker and go out, plunging homes into darkness. People would hear footsteps behind them, only to turn and find nothing there. The children were the first to truly fear her. They began to whisper about the lady in white, the ghost, who would visit them in their dreams. Some woke up screaming, claiming that Huynh had appeared at the foot of their beds, her face pale and dripping with seawater, her eyes filled with a hunger for revenge. The elders, too, began to speak of her in hushed tones, telling stories of ancient spirits who could not rest, who wandered the earth in search of justice. Huynh had become one of those spirits, a restless ghost, bound to the island by her pain, doomed to walk its shores for eternity. The villagers tried to appease her spirit. They brought offerings to the shore, candles, flowers, even food, hoping to soothe her anger, to give her the peace she had been denied in life. But it did nothing to stop the sightings, nothing to ease the dread that hung over the island like a thick fog. No amount of offerings could undo the betrayal, the broken promise that had led to her death. As the years passed, the legend of Huyhn's ghost grew. Travelers who came to Kulao heard the stories and left as quickly as they could, unwilling to stay in a place so steeped in tragedy. The villagers, trapped by their connection to the land, continued to live with the ghost's presence, but the island was never the same. It became a place of whispers, a place where the past hung heavy in the air, where the sins of one man had cursed not only his family but the entire village. There were those who said that Huyhn's ghost still wandered, searching for Tam, her anger unquenched even in death. They said that on certain nights, when the moon was full and the wind was still, you could see her walking the shore, her white dress flowing behind her like a veil, her dark eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for the man who had destroyed her future to return. But there were others, those who had seen more, who had felt her icy touch in the dead of night, who claimed that she had already found him. They spoke of how Huyhn's vengeance had not ended with Tam's death. They whispered that her ghost still roamed, not just seeking Tam, but any man who reminded her of the betrayal she had suffered. Those men, they said, would hear her voice in the wind, calling their names, and if they dared to answer, they would see her standing there, waiting for them with her hollow, sorrowful eyes. The villagers began to believe that Huyhn's ghost wasn't just bound to the island, she had become part of it. The curse of betrayal had woven itself into the very fabric of Chu Lao, and it would never leave. The island was forever haunted, its shores forever stained by the sorrow and rage of a woman who had been wronged. And no matter how many years passed, no matter how many new faces came to the island, the story of Huynh and Tam would never be forgotten. The village elders told the story to their children, and their children's children, warning them never to betray those they loved, for betrayal was a sin that could not be forgiven, not in this life, nor the next. And so the legend of Huynh became a cautionary tale, a reminder that some wrongs could never be righted, that some spirits could never be laid to rest. To this day, the people of Kulau say that if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice on the wind. She's out there, wandering the shore, her heart broken, her soul lost to the sea. And if you ever find yourself walking along the island's edge on a quiet, moonlit night, you may catch a glimpse of her, a pale figure in white, her dark eyes filled with the sorrow of a life stolen from her, her voice whispering the name of the man who had ruined her. Tam's betrayal had not just destroyed him. It had cursed the island, bound it to the memory of her love turned to vengeance, her life turned to death, and now no one could escape the shadow of that betrayal, not even in death. Huynh was still waiting, still wondering, and she would never ever be at peace.